On the morning of my wedding, there was an apron folded on the chair by the window of the room that was to be mine, and I knew before I ever touched it that it had not been made for me, because no bride's apron is worn soft at the ties. I was 19 years old that November day, and the house I was marrying into was still holding its breath from another woman's life, though nobody had told me so yet, and I stood in the doorway in my good dress with my cap pinned and my hair still damp from the washing, and I looked at that apron the way you look at a footprint in a house you believed was empty. I did not pick it up. I want to be honest about that. I stood there a long moment in the gray morning light, and then I heard Aaron's mother on the stairs, and I stepped back from the chair, and the day went on the way wedding days go, with the singing and the tables and the roast chicken after, and it was a long time before I understood what had been handed to me in that room, and longer still before one person in this world asked me whether I had wanted to carry it. I should tell you a little about the man I married, though some of you have sat with me before and know pieces of it. Aaron was a widower from the next district over, 32 years old, a good man by every account, and his first wife had passed in the spring, the year before our match was made, and a farm cannot grieve the way a man can, because a farm needs its winter work done regardless, and a man needs a wife before the snow the way a barn needs its roof on. Our families settled it the way these things are settled among us. The bishop gave the match his approval that September, and in November we were married in my parents' front room with the benches full, and the ausbund singing going on for hours, and I will tell you plain that he was kind to me that day, and nervous, and his hands were not steady when he stood beside me, and I thought to myself, this will be all right. The first thing I gave up was not my family, and it was not my home district, though I left both. It was my name, and I did not even feel it going. In my parents' house I had been Sadie, just Sadie, and in the new district I became Aaron's Sadie within the week. Aaron's Sadie, the new one, the one who came after. The women at the first GMA I attended as a married wife were warm to me, truly warm, and I believe they meant it. And still every kindness came with a small turning of the head, a measuring, a smile that was looking at something just behind my face. Somebody had set a place for me in that district before I ever arrived, and the place had a name on it, and the name was not mine. I did not have a word for it yet. I only knew that the farmhouse I came home to that night was full of a person nobody ever mentioned, and I learned young that a silence that large is not empty. It is furnished. Her name was Miriam, though I did not learn it from Aaron. I learned it from the things. Her recipe card stood in a little wooden box by the stove, written out in a small, careful hand, and her Sunday bread recipe was marked twice with pencil, the way you mark a thing you trust. Her hooks were still in the pantry, the 6 iron hooks her aprons and her bonnets had hung from, and they were kept empty, dusted, like a row of little graves. Her rosebush grew by the porch, and my first week there I took the shears to it because it was leggy and wild from a summer untended, and Aaron came in from the barn and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the cuttings in my hand, and he said, quiet, that it had always been let to grow as it pleased, and he walked back out, and nothing more was ever said, and I never touched the shears to it again. Aaron's mother came on Thursdays to help me settle in, and she was not an unkind woman, I want you to know that. She was a mother who had lost a daughter-in-law she loved like blood, but every Thursday carried its weighings. Miriam always put the pies to cool on the east sill, she would say, moving my pie from the table. Miriam's bread never fell, she would say, looking at mine. Miriam kept this floor so you could eat from it. I said yes, and I moved the pie, and I scrubbed the floor, because I was 19 and 3 years of schooling past my 8th grade end, and I believed a wife was a thing you became by being corrected. At the GMA, the older women would pat my arm and tell me I was settling in so well, considering, and they never said considering what, and I did not ask, because I already knew. I was a young tree planted in a row where a taller tree had stood, and every person who passed was measuring the gap. The quilt came to me in December, a few weeks before Christmas. Aaron's mother brought it down from the attic wrapped in a sheet, and she laid it on our bed and unfolded it, and it was nearly finished. 9 patches in blue and gray, the colors of our district, and only the last border was missing. Miriam had pieced it the winter she was expecting, her first and only winter carrying, and she had set it aside when the sickness came, and now his mother set her hands on it, and said it was a shame for good work to lie unfinished, and that it would be a comfort to Aaron to see it done, and she looked at me, and I understood what was being asked. So I sat at that quilt through the dark months, in the evenings, by the lamp, in the frame we set up in the front room, and I sewed another woman's stitches with my own hands, and my stitches were smaller than hers, and not as even, and every uneven inch felt like a confession. Aaron would come in and stand a moment and look at the quilt, and something would cross his face, and he would go to bed without saying good night, and he never once said her name. And I noticed, in those months, that he had stopped saying mine too, the way you stop saying the name of a room you no longer enter. And I will stop here a moment, because if you have sat with me this far, if you have ever felt yourself disappearing inside a life that was arranged before you came, I would be glad if you would subscribe to this channel, so you do not miss what Miriam's own mother asked me when spring came, and gladder still to read in the comments whether you were ever asked to carry something that was never yours. I read everyone. The winter went on, and the quilt grew toward its last border, and I grew quieter, and the house grew heavier, and I began to understand that I was not being asked to finish a blanket. I was being asked to take up a thread where another woman had laid it down, and to keep sewing as though my hand were her hand, and nobody in that house could see the difference, and the not seeing was the whole of it. It was the border that broke me, if something so small can be called a breaking. In March, I basted the last border pieces, and I sat down one gray afternoon to sew them, and I put my needle in, and I could not pull it through. My hand simply would not do it. I sat there the whole afternoon with the needle standing in the cloth, and the light going, and the stove ticking, and I wept without making a sound, the way a wife learns to weep in a house where her grief has no name and no standing. I had no words yet for what was wrong in me. Miriam had died expecting, with this quilt unfinished, and I was a living girl sewing a dead girl's border, and some part of me understood that once the border was sewn, there would be nothing left of her that was not finished, put away, and replaced by me, and I did not want to be the finishing of her. The next morning I rolled the quilt in its sheet, and I did the one thing I had been half-warned never to do. I walked the back fields to Fanny's place, Fanny being Miriam's mother, an old order widow who kept a small farm with her unmarried son at the edge of the district, a woman I had seen at the wedding standing straight as a fence post and weeping without a sound. The women said she was sore about the second marriage, that she had not set foot in Aaron's house since the funeral, that it was better to leave her be. I walked 2 miles in a March wind with that quilt on my arm like a swaddled child, rehearsing how I would make myself small, how I would tell her I was doing my best by her daughter's things, expecting, if I am honest, to be scolded, to be told to go home and finish what my betters had started, and be grateful for the place I had been given. She was in her yard feeding the chickens when I came up the lane, and she looked at me a long moment and at the bundle on my arm, and she knew what it was before I said a word, and she set down her pail and opened her door to me, and her kitchen was small and warm and smelled of coffee, and there was not one thing in it that had been kept as a grave. She made me sit, and she poured the coffee, and she let me unwrap the quilt on her table, and she ran her old hand over the 9 patches, the way you touch a face you have missed, and for a long while she said nothing at all, and I sat with my hands in my lap and waited for the scolding. Instead, she looked up at me, and her eyes were wet and very clear, and she asked me the question that I had needed asked for 5 months without knowing I needed it. "Do you know why he chose you?" she said. And I said what I had been taught to think, that it was because the farm needed a wife and I was of an age and willing. She shook her head slowly, and she said, "Kind, listen to me now, because you are carrying a thing that was never yours to carry, and somebody must tell you what it is. He chose you because you were young," she said, "young enough to have never seen how my Miriam kept a house, young enough that no living woman would have to be measured against the dead one. A blank page," she said, and she said it without bitterness, the way you say a true thing that grieves you. He did not choose you for yourself, because he did not know you, and he did not choose you to be Miriam, because no one could be. He chose you so that the house could go on unchanged around a woman who would not know enough to change it. And then she took my hands in hers, and she said the thing that turned my whole life on its hinge. "My daughter's things are not your burden, child. You give me what is hers, and you keep only what is yours, and you begin your own marriage from this day, because a wife is not a replacement part in a grieving man's house, and grief has no right to make a museum out of a home, and no right at all to make a garment out of a living girl." She told me she had not been sore at me, not one day. She had been sore at the silence, at a whole district that had buried her daughter and then furnished a new bride with her leavings and called it kindness. And she had stayed away because she could not bear to watch a young thing disappear the way I was disappearing. I sat at her table with the coffee going cold between us, and I cried out loud for the first time since my wedding, in front of a woman I had been told to fear, and she held my hands and let me, and outside the wind moved over the fields, and something in me that had been folded up very small began, for the first time, to unfold. We spent that whole afternoon boxing Miriam's things, and I want you to understand what it meant, that it was the two of us who did it, her mother and me, the two women the district had cast as rivals in a contest neither of us had ever entered. Fanny took the quilt home with her, and the apron from the chair by my window, which had been Miriam's wedding apron, and the little box of recipe cards went with her too, all but one. She copied nothing. She pressed the choufle pie card into my hand and closed my fingers over it, and she said, "Her choufle is worth keeping, Louis. Her shadow is not," and she told me to bake it in my own way, on my own sill, and to think of Miriam kindly when I did, the way you remember the dead, as people, not as measurements. I rode home in her son's buggy with an empty arm and a full heart. And that evening Aaron came in from the barn and stopped in the pantry doorway and looked at the 6 bare hooks, and I watched him understand, and I did not explain, and he did not ask. He was quiet a long time, and then he said my name. Not Aaron's Sadie, not the new one, not nothing at all, which is what he had been saying for months. Just Sadie, plain and first, asking would I like him to bring in more wood for the stove? And I stood at that stove with Miriam's choufle card propped against the sugar tin and my own apron on the first hook. And I answered him, and I do not think he ever knew what turned in our house that night. But it turned, the way a field turns under the plow, everything that was buried coming up into the light. We did not become a perfect marriage that spring, and I will not pretend it for the story. But the house stopped being a museum, and it began to be a home, and the rose bush by the porch is tended now the way a grave is tended, with love and with boundaries, and I have my own recipes in a box by the stove, written in my own hand, and some of them are marked twice with pencil, the way you mark a thing you trust. If you are a wife listening to this, or a mother, or a woman who was ever handed a life that belonged to somebody else, I want you to hear me gently, because I am not angry anymore, and anger was never the point of this telling. The dead deserve their memory. Miriam deserved her rose bush and her 9 patches, and her mother weeping straight-backed at my wedding, and none of that needed to come out of my hide to be honored. And the living deserve their own names. No wife should have to wear another woman's outline, and no husband's grief was ever meant to be his bride's garment, and no mother-in-law's measuring was ever meant to be the mirror a young thing has to see herself in. And I want you to know that I do not hate the people who handed me that apron. Aaron was a grieving man doing what grieving men do when nobody teaches them another way, and his mother was guarding the only piece of Miriam she could still reach. And the neighbors were kind people who had simply never been asked to think about what their comparisons cost, and that is almost sadder, because inherited sorrow asks nobody's permission to keep going, and it wears the face of ordinary kindness so well that you can live inside it for years before you feel its shape. What I know now, what Fanny gave me at her table with the coffee going cold, is that a custom of silence is only a thing people do, and things people do can be done differently. One kitchen, one question, one old woman brave enough to ask a young one what she knows. If you are carrying something that was never yours, set it down. If someone in your house is carrying something, ask her about it. For 5 months, I had no name for what I was disappearing into. I have a word for it now. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I wrote it all down, the whole story, the parts I could say out loud and the parts I could only write, in my book, and the full story is in the first pinned comment below, if it should ever be a comfort to you. Until next time, keep your own name and let the dead rest kindly, and God bless you and yours.